Welcome to the Lansdowne Public Library's Geek Out podcast, where we geek out about just about anything. I'm Jeff.
And I'm David. Everyone's passionate about something, so we'll sit down with a variety of people to chat about their interests. There's so many hobbies, activities, and fandoms out there, it can be a little daunting for someone on the outside. So, we'll geek out with our guests to get excited for something new, or something old, and hopefully make it a little more approachable. So let's just go around the table and introduce ourselves. I am co-host David.
The other co-host, Jeff.
I'm James Greenfeld, and I'm supposed to know about trains.
And I'm Michael Sheehan, a member of the library staff, and I'm here to help out.
And as you may have guessed, today we're here to discuss trains.
Well, what is a train? A big wheelie thing. It's metal.
The hosts in this case are what you might call laymen, so we are going to be deferring a bit more to the experts here.
So, Jim, why don't you give us a bit of a description of what's your knowledge, what's your specialty, about trains?
Well, let's say this is about railroads. Trains run on railroads. Train could be something that hangs behind a bride's dress. But what was the question? What was so special? Or what?
Well, with your, what is you're very knowledgeable about trains and railroads, but what's your forte?
My interest is basically a historical one. I've always been interested in the history of the railroads in a particular situation. I mean, I grew up over in South Jersey, so most of what my interest was in the various lines that ran between Philadelphia and Camden. Since I've lived in Delaware County, I've also become interested in the railroad history of southeastern Pennsylvania, mostly Delaware County, but you have to consider some of the other areas. I mean, I've been interested in trains since I was very young. I was able to watch trains from my backyard. In those days, back in the early 50s, there were still a few steam locomotives running, which I'm still in love with, which I guess you'd call a ferroequinologist, a lover of the iron horse. But over the years, railroads have sort of faded, and they've made a bit of a comeback in the last 30 or 40 years after the railroads were basically deregulated, I think around 1980. And so there was a more of an even playing field. But, railroads in this country sort of peaked around the era of about 1910. After World War I, basically in the mid-1920s, they started to go into a decline. There were more roads, there were more automobiles that could navigate bad roads, and air travel wasn't really a significant factor as of yet. It quickly became one after the 1930s. Actually, you have people like Charles Lindbergh proving that you could fly across the Atlantic solo in 1927. That was.
Yeah.
It was interesting because back in those days, the Pennsylvania Railroad put out a little brochure, and they embraced air travel, believe it or not. In those days, you could take a train from, let's say, New York City, ride overnight to Ohio, and then you'd get on a plane that would take you to the next leg of the flight, then take another train for the next night because they weren't flying at night, and then they'd finish off, I guess, flying out to Los Angeles. So it was kind of cumbersome, but that's all they could do. The airplane range, the range for aircraft wasn't that good, and the reliability certainly wasn't.
Yeah. Interrupt you for a second, Jim.
Yeah.
One of the things to me, I'm more interested in the 19th century with trains.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things there is, if you wanted to go out to the coast in a wagon, it would probably be 20 miles a day, which means it's literally months.
Yeah.
A train, by the end of the 19th century, will get you there in less than a week. And that's a big, big difference. The country changes because of that. It's all of a sudden a small country that you can unite together. I mean, if you think about it, in the 19th century, California was as rich as a country. They didn't need Washington and New York. And if we didn't have those iron rails connecting, I would be willing to bet that the United States wouldn't be the United States today. You'd have 5 or 6 countries. You'd have the country of California. You'd have Oregon country. You'd have Texas country. You'd have the Confederacy would secede, and successfully so. You would have the Midwest maybe be Indian territory, or it might be divided into 2 or 3 nations. The railroad literally tied the country together when communications were so damn slow and that you could not you could not get from one end of the country to the other without months of travel, literally. And the railroads, I mean, I think they were more impactful than air travel has been, because they were at a time when overland travel was so tedious and hard and expensive. I mean, again, literally, it would be easier to go from Philadelphia to London, and cheaper, than it would be to go from Philadelphia to New Mexico.
Right. Well, there was a lot of development also taking place in the country. There wasn't really a transcontinental railroad until 1869.
Right.
I believe that it was signed into effect by Lincoln during the Civil War.
It was.
It was finally finished in 1869. And, there's no two ways about it. The Transcontinental Railroad and the other lines that followed changed things, not always to the better. If you were a Native American, a buffalo, or any other wild beast that happened to get in the way of this, westward course of civilization, the manifest destiny was the other idea about America spreading from one coast to the other. It wasn't great for everybody, but overall, it did tie the country together. And it certainly allowed faster communication, not only with people, but also goods.
Yeah, I mean, you just brought up the buffalo. Buffalo Bill got his nickname because what he did was he shot buffalo for the workers who were building the railroad. And this is the way they would do it. The Indians would kill one buffalo at a time and use every part of it. Buffalo Bill would stampede a whole herd of cattle over a cliff.
Oh, absolutely.
And then what they would do is take the part they needed for food, and then they might leave hundreds and hundreds of buffalo carcasses just to rot. And they literally, that's how the buffalo disappeared from America. We repopulated the buffalo in America by going to Yugoslavia because they were transplanted there to save them, and they thrived there, and then we retransplanted them here. We literally destroyed the Indian capacity for life, the Native American capacity for life, by destroying their environment, and the buffalo was a central part of that.
Well, to a certain extent, it was also a fringe benefit because they wanted to push, the Native Americans out. And, they would drive them off of cliffs, and sometimes to do that, they'd set the whole prairie on fire in order to do it. So it is kind of an economical disaster in certain ways if things went down.
They would also populate the West. I mean, I have friends who live in Minnesota. Well, the highest percentage ethnic background in Minnesota is Swedes. How did that happen? The railroads were building railroads through Indian territory. And we're going to say Indian because that's what they would have said in the 19th century.
Right.
And what they wanted to do was to get the Indians to move off of that land without necessarily a military intervention. And the way to do it is to populate the area with more and more white European settlers. So they put flyers out in Sweden and said, if you come to America, we will pay your freight across the ocean and bring you to Minnesota and give you a free homestead of land. And that's how all the Swedes came to Minnesota. And that kind of is repeated again and again. And just one last thing here. I know I talk too much sometimes. When you're settling the West, the majority of settlers are men. The mail order bride begins with the railroads. The men are out there and they want wives, and you need wives to have children, or at least women to have children. And so the mail order bride industry began with the railroad, just saying, we'll bring women out there to you and you should commingle.
Yeah, the railroads also provided these immigrant trains.
Yes.
Not particularly posh accommodation. I mean, it was the same way with ocean liners. People think about the Titanic and about all the fashionable rich people who went down on it, but that was on the backs of all the steerage passengers who were actually paying the way for the whole voyage. And it was a matter of fact that they would have to move these people out west, and so they had these immigrant trains. I think there are many photographs of some of the families that were moving. I mean, there were families. I mean, most were men, you're right. Whole families were more or less uprooted from Europe and brought over. A lot of people opted to simply stay in New York, Philadelphia, or Baltimore, but then a lot of them had the means of travel. The old days of the Conestoga wagon and all that business didn't stop right. Once you have an easy way to get from one place to another, even if you don't have great accommodations.
And if you were to talk to an American in the 19th century and say, describe the continent out there, they say there's the East Coast and there's the West Coast, and in between is the Great American Desert. And nobody wanted to settle there because its reputation was it's the Great American Desert. Why would you want to settle there? And the railroads needed populations along the route. And there's another piece of technology that changes things, and that's the steel-tipped plow. because it was the Great American Desert, because the hard grass that grew on the plains, if you used a wooden plow, it broke.
Just couldn't get anything
The steel-tip plow would cut through it, and then all of a sudden they discovered, hey, this is some of the richest farmland in the world. They thought it was unarable, that you couldn't grow anything there except the grass that grew there, and that you could feed cattle on, and you could do things like that. But actually have farms, well, again, trains are part of the technology history, and they changed the country. The steel-tip plow is real important in the Midwest.
That's I don't think anyone would have expected that to have that sort of a connection, especially to railroads or even the expansion and lifeline of the country.
I'll tell you a theory that I have, that the first Amazon was in the 1900s, the early 1900s, and it was Montgomery Ward. Montgomery Ward was a mail order catalog. So if you lived in Sacramento and there was a dress that they're making out in New York, you could order it. You would put on a train, travel to the nearest station to your house, and then a wagon would take it to your home. They didn't have to have a storefront. They didn't have a storefront. It's basically the model for Amazon with the technology of the 19th, early 20th century. But it's the same idea. And they made a lot of money.
Of course, they printed those catalogs, which people liked. They were done with the catalog. It wound up in the outhouse.
Yes, it did.
It served the second...
A more useful purpose.
Well, perhaps.
So we have now a very barren, but that's to say that we barely scratched the ice of railroads across the nation and their origins. But what about locally?
Well, locally, one thing I think I want to start with, this one specific, it doesn't really have much of an effect on railroading in general, let's say, in our county, but it does have pride of place in one respect. There was a fellow who emigrated from Scotland back in, let's say, 1750s or 1760s. His name was Thomas Leaper. Mr. Leaper served on the side of the Continentals, opposing the British with the U.S. They weren't the U.S.
No, they weren't then.
No.
Continentals.
Continentals, good. Our side. Okay. He was in several businesses. He operated like tobacco mills and other things. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was actually he was Jefferson's landlord. So he was friends with a lot of people in high places. He had emigrated initially to Maryland, but then he moved to Philadelphia, and he purchased some land out south of, let's say, Swarthmore. Anyway, he had a quarry there, and he wanted a way to move the stone from his quarry to Tidewood. He wanted to build a canal along Crum Creek, which his neighbors and the state legislature wouldn't allow. So, with the help of a fellow by the name of John Thompson, whose name is going to come into this a little bit later, they built an early railway, some people prefer to call it a tramway, from his quarry, which was he named Avondale, down to Ridley Creek, which is about 3/4 of a mile. This was a railway built of wood, and it was pulled by, and in some cases they say oxen, in some cases they say horses.
Horses, yeah.
The track itself was all made out of wood, but the heavy cars tended to tear up the wooden rails. And again, there's some conflict as to what they used next. Some reports say that they used stone sills. Others say they simply used wooden rails with what they had with strapped steel rails on top of that, which was something that they used on our roads also. So Leaper's Canal was, his railroad operated from about 1809 to about 1828. Now, it was actually the first permanent railway in North America. There had been a couple other examples of temporary operations, but it was also the first one that was actually surveyed out. And the survey was done by the aforementioned Mr. Thompson. That map exists today in the Delaware County
Historical Society?
Not the Historical Society. It's the Science out in Media. I forget the actual name. Anyway, there's a little museum and a society out there. It's really a cool place to visit. I think it was the Institute or Museum of Science or something like that. That's where the map is now. After 1828, Mr. Leaper was finally able to build his canal along Crum Creek. And that lasted for a few years, but then he went back to having a railway because because it turned out to be a much easier way to get the stone, in this case, down to Tidewater. Mr. Weeper's stone, when I know, went to partially building the original Delaware Breakwater.
Okay.
And there were a few other buildings. Offhand, I can't remember exactly, but he was one of the main suppliers around here for stone. The railroad itself was later, the right-of-way was later purchased by the Baltimore and Ohio when it built it. And I think it lasted in place probably until World War II when the steel was all torn up. But again, in terms of being the first permanent railway in North America, as well as the first one surveyed, Weeper's Railroad sort of has that pride of place.
Yeah. What helps to kind of make a leap in the story is, I know there's a pun there, is that you're talking about what is the early history of railroads, which is individual lines. Where railroads become powerful in the country is when they form railway systems, because literally the railroads had different sized tracks. So that if I had my railroad, I could drive up to a point, but if I wanted to go further, somebody else had a line that was a different measure. So I had to unload my cars and put them on their cars. And you needed to organize this so that, and there's the Penn Central and the New York railroads that form systems that can go to all various kinds of parts of the country, and on rails that were of the same size so that you could run one train straight through it.
Well, actually, at one point, particularly in the South, the idea of state rights was embraced. They had different, the word we're looking for is gauge.
Yes.
Standard gauge is 4 foot 8.5 inches. And there were different railroads that had different gauges. Standard gauge was imported from England.
Could we just get a brief definition of gauge?
Gauge is the width between the rails. Now, that's between the flangeways, not the center of the rails. Okay, that's whatever you have a rail vehicle has to be able to fit on those tracks, has to be basically the right gauge. I mean, at one point, there was when the Pennsylvania Railroad bought the New Jersey lines, for instance, their gauge was actually 4 foot 9. You wouldn't think a half an inch, or a few inches would make a difference, but they had to change that. Down in the South, they embraced states' rights, and they didn't really want the trains to run through. They wanted to be able to stop and say, well, you got to take everything off here. It impeded the South to somewhat during the war, but actually they managed to get around it. Some of their railroads, I forget what battle it was. Years ago, I had to do a map for the Civil War Museum and Library, and it involved the different gauges. And even with one battle, I can't remember which one it was, but the South had to move their men on one railroad, and they had to get off and get onto another train, and they still beat the Union to face
You might be thinking about Manassas.
Possibly.
It's the first battle of the war, and Lincoln is thinking, we beat them in one big battle, and this war is over. And they were fighting to a stalemate. One side's winning, the other side's winning. And then via train, the South brought in reserve troops, and all of a sudden it just turned the battle over, and we knew we were going to be in for a long war. There was a thought that emotionally, one quick defeat would just take the heart out of the South. It almost took the heart out of the North, because Manassas is really close to Washington, D.C., and there was a fear that they were going to come right to the capital and get us.
And it also shows, the railroads turned out to be a technological asset as far as being able to wage war. It was the first basic conflict in which railroads had an important part. The English had trains, and there's a famous painting of a soldier going off to the Crimean, but he's getting on a train and waving to his sweetheart. But in the field of battle, they weren't there yet.
No.
But in the American Civil War, technically speaking, was
very important. And the North had an advantage. Actually, the railroads helped to trigger the Civil War. One of the most important events that led to the Civil War is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, we had the Missouri Compromise, which said there's no slavery above a certain line. Kansas-Nebraska Act said it can be up to the people who settle there. And that all of a sudden brought great fear. Slavery is going to be extended into territories. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act came about because there were 3 proposed routes for a transatlantic, transcontinental railroad, a northern, middle, and southern. The South had enough veto power in the Senate to block any of those routes. They would have supported the southern route, obviously. Mm-hmm. Stephen Douglas made a deal with them. You give me the northern route to the railroad, which is the route they are going to use for the Transcontinental Railroad, and will pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act and allow you to have slavery north of the line. And that's one of the major events that got the Civil War fires up and made the war inevitable. I mean, for some people, I don't know, that's in like 1854-ish. Those were the first battles of the Civil War because bloody Kansas was a battlefield as pro-slavers and anti-slavers met and battled. John Brown got his infamy or fame there, however you look at him.
Well, I always thought in many ways the situation leading up to the Civil War, to me, is much more interesting than the war itself.
Mm-hmm.
The various sort of compromise and the other things that went on beforehand. Finally, the war was finally set off in 1960. This was a fight that was long coming.
Yes, and one of the biggest pieces of tinder was that Kansas-Nebraska Act.
So anyway, I guess as far as the local history is, I want to touch on something you said about the various lines merging together, and that's something that had happened very early on. Historically speaking, I think I do want to mention in Delaware County, at the very tip of Delaware County, you have the town of Wayne, and part of the railroad's main line cuts across there. And that's the only part of Delaware County that runs. But I think to get a good picture of what was going on in the history of the time, we have to mention the Philadelphia and Columbia Road. Mm-hmm. The Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad was part of what was called the main line of public works. The state of New York built the Erie Canal in the 1820s. And what that did was basically gave New York the upper hand in trade.
Big time.
Philadelphia had been a contender, but once the Erie Canal was built, the shift in power actually went to New York City. So in the late 1820s, the legislature of Pennsylvania, as well as the Philadelphia merchants, felt that we had to have something like that here, too. Across New York, running through the Mohawk Valley, and then, of course, to the Hudson River down to New York, you had pretty much a water-level route. There was a canal, and it had locks and things, but it wasn't the kind of obstacles you had across the state of Pennsylvania.
No. And
what they came up in this main line of public works, and by the way, main line, consider the main line of Pennsylvania, various communities out to Paoli. It was, yes, the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Prior to that, it was the main line of public works, and that's where the term main actually comes from. Mm-hmm. What the state came up with was a railroad that ran from Philadelphia out to Columbia on the Susquehanna River. By there, you would go by Western Division Canal, I think it was, and then another canal further up, the Juniata Canal. Then you had to transfer to the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and then another set of canals that went to Pittsburgh. So it was this sort of jumbled, I don't like to say it was a mess, but basically it was, because it involved changing trains and boats. At one point, they actually developed canal boats that were sectioned, could be taken apart. Yes. They could be loaded on railroad cars. So you could get on a train down in front of the exchange, which was actually a canal boat on a flat car, and you could ride all the way across the state in this fashion. But it wasn't really a good situation. The Pennsylvania Railroad later on bought the main line of public works, and they kept the Philadelphia and Columbia, but that actually gave them their entrance into Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania Railroad was formed in 1849, and the fellow who was most important in its development early on was J. Edgar Thompson. Now, Thompson was the son of John Thompson, we mentioned before. He grew up in Springfield. If you go out Baltimore Pike, there's a marker that says that he grew up near here. And Thompson actually not only was a great engineer, but he was one of the men that actually set up the original methods of doing business that railroads had. His organizational skills and corporate skills, I guess you call it nowadays, hadn't been really applied much to anything else, because railroads are very complicated. They take in a lot of factors. You have to know about geology, real estate, whatever you're running your trains on, whether it be cordwood or coal, what kind of area you're going to be building into, if you're going to try to reach coal fields or anything. And Thompson was really the man for the job. I guess I want to mention another fellow, but I'll get to him in a few minutes, maybe. I think the other thing that I want to talk about now is the main railroad in Delaware was what was known as the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, the PWB. And that is basically the same railroad that is Amtrak's main line today, which runs down say from Philadelphia down to Wilmington, Baltimore, and eventually to Washington. The PW&B itself was made up of several lines. You had the main line, as I just mentioned. Philadelphia and Westchester is what we have here in Lansdowne. That went out to Wawa. It was further built up to Westchester, who had the Philadelphia and Baltimore Central, which ran from Wawa out to the Susquehanna River. It was the Chester Creek Railroad, which ran from a spot in Chester called Lamoken up along the Chester Creek. Most of these lines came together out there at Wawa. And then there was another one, the Philadelphia and Delaware County, which came off the railroad out at East Lansdowne. What's the
Fernwood?
Fernwood, right. Fernwood, and that ran eventually up to Newtown Square. And there was also a short line that came off called the Cardington Branch, which ran up Cobb's Creek. Now, these lines all eventually fell under the corporate aegis of the PW&B. One of the important improvements the railroad made was in 1871, they built what was called the Derby Improvement. This line was built further in, and that's what the alignment Amtrak's line is now, later in Pennsylvania Railroad's main line. And this was built further inland because the railroad often flooded along the Delaware River, and they could basically change some of the curves and other things. It was well built, and it was also grade separated, so it was a pretty good operation. The original part of the PW&B that was abandoned was immediately sold to the Philadelphia and Reading. That was their Chester branch, running between Gray's Ferry and Chester. And that's the only part of the Philadelphia and Reading, or it's often called just the Reading, that is in Delaware County. So you can see that a lot of these mergers took place way back when. It wasn't something that only happened when the railroads were going broke and they had to consolidate their operations. But this is something that happened in this area. The PW&B was the main corporation for transportation in that respect. But it, too, wound up being merged. It was control of the railroad was bought by the Pennsylvania Railroad. I think it was, check my notes here, 1880? It's not the right page. Here it is. 1881, actually. And it's kind of interesting because their purchase of the PW&B changed history in Delaware County pretty much, because at that time, the PW&B was not only run with their trains, the Baltimore and Ohio was running their trains to New York over that route. Pennsylvania was using the route. Of course, it was the PW&B. Once the PRR took charge, that was the end of the B&O running on those tracks. And what had to happen then was they had to build their own line. It was later called the Royal Blue Line, which was the Philadelphia division of Baltimore and Ohio. And of course, that goes through Delaware County. Unlike the old PW&B main line, it's not grade separated. So, middle of the night, if you hear train horns all night, it's going through Collingdale and everything. It's not the whole operation.
You were talking about how the railroads made Delaware County what it is. If you were a town in America, if you didn't have a railroad stopping by your town, you were backwater. Originally, in the original route for the Transcontinental, it was supposed to go through Council Bluffs, not Chicago. Some corrupt dealings were made, and Chicago became the railroad capital of the country.
Right.
But it was a nothing place.
Well, that's something that happened quite often. I mean, what railroads depended on was a subscription of stock by various people. People to put up money. I mean, over in South Jersey, there was supposed to be a line that went from basically Camden down to Cape May. And they would start to build, and they get to a certain point, and the people, let's say in Bridgeton, put up money and say, hey, we'll give you all this money, but you got to go through here first. So you wind up with a kind of a crooked operation, crooked meaning actually crooked.
Literally and
They were
figuratively.
crooked in other ways usually too. But that was the interesting thing about how a lot of railroads didn't follow their original goal. They had to more or less go around wherever the money was sometimes. And that's how, people...
And you knew if you were a town, if you didn't have the railroad stop there, you were dead. The town was going to disappear.
There's another guy I wanted to mention in connection with all this stuff, and that's Thomas A. Scott.
Yeah.
Mr. Scott was basically J. Edgar Thompson's lieutenant. He was the vice president of Pennsylvania. And he is interesting because as far as Lansdowne's concerned, first of all, he lived here when he was the president of the railroad. After Thompson died, he took over as the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He lived right over here, a few blocks from the library. I think the house that was built for him is called Devonshire. It was built by the Philadelphia architect Frank Furness. It's situated between, appropriately, Scottdale Road, which takes its name from Mr. Scott, and Lansdowne Court. Well, there was another fellow, whatever his name offhand is.
Well, while you're looking that up, I think now's a good chance to plug. If you are interested in coming on the show and delivering a topic for the day, we do have a sign-up online. You go up to lansdownelibrary.org/podcasts. You can just click the big register here green button, put in whatever it is you want to talk about, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, the fellow's name that I was looking for was Mr. Griffith, Richard Griffith, as a matter of fact. He was a landowner here in Lansdowne, and he had a business basically up, I believe, on Wycombe Avenue. Now, we just talked about the PW&B. PW&B had a station in Derby. There was no Lansdowne at the time. The station for Lansdowne at the time was called Derby Road. But Mr. Griffith was kind of ticked because his deliveries were always winding up in Derby as opposed to Derby Road. So Tom Scott, being a local guy, president of the railroad, Griffith went and talked to him. Said, "Can we change the name?" And Scott said, "Sure, what do you want to call it?" They came up with Lansdowne. Scott put the word out to change the name, but the railroad employees sort of dragged their feet. So after waiting for too long, Mr. Griffith simply made his own sign, tacked it up on the Derby Road station. So that's where Lansdowne actually gets its name. And that's not uncommon. There are many towns all over the country, either because they're established as a stop on a railroad, or maybe the railroad decided they didn't like the name of the town, made something else. So that's where Lansdowne gets its name, and it has its connection with the railroad aspect. While we're on Delaware County history, there's another aspect of this that I think we ought to mention, and that's Locomotive Building. Okay, back in the early 1830s, there was a line called the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown. Later became part of the Reading, and they needed a locomotive. And they approached a fellow by the name of Matthias W. Baldwin. He had been commissioned by the Philadelphia Museum, which, by the way, was in Old Independence Hall. It was originally Peale's Museum. And they wanted a model of a steam locomotive. There weren't any locomotives around yet in this area, unless you went over to Jersey. So Baldwin built this model. Management of Philadelphia, Germantown, Norristown said, "Well, we want you to build us a real engine." So he went over to Bordentown, New Jersey, where Camden and Ambrose had just got a locomotive from George Stephenson in England. It hadn't even been built yet, hadn't been assembled. That engine turned out to be what's now known as the John Bull, and that's in the National Museum of the Smithsonian. But Mr. Baldwin took measurements, and he fooled around, and eventually came up with something that was acceptable, although he said he was really kind of frustrated over the whole thing. He said, "We're never going to build another locomotive," which was not the case. Well, by the way, the engine he built for them was called the Old Ironsides. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. Some of the parts, I believe, are in existence, although I'm not sure about it. But Baldwin became the largest locomotive manufacturer in the world. The works in Philadelphia were down on Spring Garden, Broad Street.
My grandfather worked there.
Okay, a lot of people actually did. That was another thing that the railroads provided, and that was often employment, not only for the railroad company itself, but for the suppliers. During the early years of the century, 1906, I think, Baldwin had bought up land down in Eddystone, which is, of course, part of Delaware County, because they had planned to build a new plant down there. Eddystone had port facilities. There was a lot of other manufacturing along the river there. Delaware County had quite a bit of a waterfront industrial area, which later on turned into a kind of a rust belt because most of the industry left. It was Sunship, Eddystone Print Works, the Eddystone Manufacturing Company. And once Baldwin opened its plant in Delaware County, General Steel Castings also moved there. Their main plant, I believe they're still in business, is out in Ohio. but they were a good supplier for Baldwin, plus the fact Baldwin manufactured things that could be exported directly from the waterfront there. As it turns out, Baldwin, I guess at the height of their existence, had about 18,000 employees. Now, I couldn't find out how many employees they had when they closed in the mid-50s. That's one piece of information that I couldn't find. But Baldwin was actually kind of glad. They needed more room because they were very cramped as to what they could build in Philadelphia, the original plant. And Baldwin sort of gave them the room in Eddystone to basically spread out. Another factor was the labor situation in Philadelphia, because Baldwin had endured a very traumatic strike, and many of the younger people were willing to come out and work in Eddystone, whereas some of the people that had struck the company wound up staying in Philadelphia and doing other things. But basically, it's been characterized differently as Baldwin running away from labor troubles and running to Eddystone, but they really needed the room. Their factory was, I have here, about 600 acres, a lot of it under roof. And if you want to know where the plant was, if you're on I-95, basically the only part of Baldwin's that still existed, what's now called Baldwin Tower. It was a big cruciform office building, which you can see as you travel on 95. Past that building, and you're on 95, you're actually traveling over where the floor of the tender shop, where they later built the diesel locomotives for us. Baldwin basically went out of business for a lot of reasons. A lot of it wasn't their fault. They did not embrace the new diesel electric locomotive technology right away. When that was starting to go down, the Second World War came, and companies like Baldwin and other companies could only build what they had to build. The War Production Board forbade them from introducing any new models. So General Motors, which had a successful road locomotive at the time, was in a good position to basically become the dominant leader in locomotive building. But Baldwin tried. Their methods didn't work out the way General Motors came up with a product that was very flexible, at high availability. And Baldwin was still stuck with the idea of building bigger and bigger locomotives. General Motors came up with the idea of multiple unit operation, where you have one engine with several units, several other locomotive units that can be controlled from the same crew. Baldwin had that later on, but their locomotives couldn't multiple unit with other companies like Alco. And I mentioned Alco, which is the American Locomotive Company. They were actually formed, again, with a merger of several other locomotive companies like Schenectady, Brooks, Richmond. They basically formed the American Locomotive Company in order to be able to compete with Baldwin. That's how big Baldwin was. So, again, Baldwin wasn't a railroad, but it was an integral part of the railroads in this country. It was probably half of all steam locomotives, but nearly that many were actually built by Baldwin. We'll be watching TV, and if I see an engine that's been restored, or even an old movie with an old engine, I'll say to my wife, that was built in Delaware County. That was kind of interesting.
One, I really like all that you had to say about the Delaware County stuff. My interest or my knowledge is more about kind of the national impact. And I think about, say, the Midwest before railroads came in. Basically, you had to exist in subsistence farming, because to transport your goods over land by wagon or whatever added so much expense to it, you couldn't sell your products. So you subsistence farmed or used a little extra for bartering. If you think of every name brand you've got in your kitchen, Kellogg's, Pillsbury, whatever, they became national dealers in these food goods because the railroads could say, oh, we can send it to California. We can send it to New York. You can grow it in Ohio or Iowa or wherever you grow it, and we can get it somewhere viably. Meatpacking became gigantic because trains could transport it. All of the foods that we eat that have become national brands, it's the railroads that made them. It's a force multiplier in the economy in ways that almost nothing else. Well, right now we have the Silicon Valley with all their technology that's become a force multiplier in the economy. But I think that you have to think of the railroad in the same way. All kinds of the steel industry grew, the food industry grew, everything grew all because of the railroad. The railroad changed America more than anything else. If I could recommend a book to you to read, there's a novel by Frank Norris called Octopus.
Oh, yes.
And part of what it is about is, and making the connection to Amazon, the railroad had its tentacles everywhere. Mm-hmm. They would take their kickbacks. They would, every town had to deal with the railroad, and the railroad had all the leverage. And it was kind of a book about the anger at much of the rural middle of the country having to deal with the power of the railroads because you couldn't beat them. I think in our world, we have forgotten that the railroads ran the country for a significant part. And the real growth of the country was triggered by the railroads almost more than any other technological advance.
Sure, the political ramifications. The so-called robber barons.
That's where you get all the big fortunes, whether it's Stanford or all these people who made their money. Owning railroad systems was the key, and they did. And you had really what would be the equivalent of billionaires in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. I mean, they weren't billionaires in that time period because the money value is different, but they would be billionaires today. And it was, again, you can't overestimate how important the railroads were in the economy. I just throw one last thing in there, and you kind of touched on it. One of the things about the railroads is that is really, it's not the first, but it's the biggest event in American history where the government began financing projects. Mm-hmm. We built roads and we did other things the government money used, but building the Transcontinental Railroad, they spent billions of dollars. The government spent.
Exactly. It wasn't necessarily the people that were running the show.
No.
It wasn't their money, but they knew how to use the government's money.
And the government's...
And the land grants and all that business.
And the leverage. We need the railroad. Mm-hmm. Without the railroad, we're not going to grow. We're not going to hold together. And therefore, you would pay any kind of money that they asked for. And they would put in fraudulent demands for money, and they'd get it. Because nobody was going to... They didn't want the progress to stop.
Of course, you have character. Durant of the Union Pacific.
Yep.
Jay Gould.
Jay Gould, he was a scoundrel.
Oh, absolutely. And really, sometimes you watch television, the news, and you can't believe what some of them are saying or what they're getting away with. But if you looked at the way Gould and his gang built the Erie Railroad point,
yep,
as much Erie stock as Cornelius Vanderbilt bought up, Gould and his buddies were in a basement somewhere printing more stock.
More stock, absolutely. Do you know where the term ordering stock comes from? It's from cattle drives. They would drive the cattle to the railroad, and what they would do is before they would have the cattle soak up as much water as they can, drink. It would increase their weight. Exactly. They get paid at that level, and by the time they reached where they were going, well, that was water weight. It was gone. Yeah. Pissed away. But it's not a financial term. It literally is cattle. You ordered the stock.
Well, as we begin to wrap up here, for people who might be interested in either the history of trains or even learning about modern trains and railroads in Delaware County, where might people go, or where might they even go to see these mechanical marvels?
Well, to learn about anything, your best bet to start off is go to the internet. Any subject that you might be interested in, whether you like Wikipedia or not, it has something and it can provide, information to go to different places. I mean, there's any number of books. Book on the Transcontinental Railroad, I think. Nothing like it.
There's an old book, and I don't remember. The Stephen Ambrose book. Right. Yeah, Stephen Ambrose wrote a great book on the building of Transcontinental Railroad. Nothing like it, or something like that is the title. You're right. There's another book. I don't remember the author. I read it 100 years ago. Called "The World the Railroad Built," or "The Train Built." I'm not sure which. It's one of those two, which lets you understand how much of a force magnifier the railroads really were.
Mm-hmm. And if you're interested in seeing things, the Old Franklin Institute is a place you can go to see a few things. They have a huge experimental locomotive built by Baldwin's, which Baldwin donated to the museum. It's now in the museum. Unless they scrap it to get it out, it's not going anywhere. There's a couple other examples there, but you have places where they run old trains, like out at Strasburg, Bloomington and Western, or some of the local places. A worthwhile trip to Baltimore would be the B&O Museum, because it's not only housed in an old car shop roundhouse, but it has some very significant early and later locomotives, examples of cars. Smithsonian Institution, as was mentioned before, if you're out on the West Coast, the California State Railroad Museum is just about incomparable. And again, there's probably many other places that you know if you just want to see an old-time train. One thing you can do, a friend of mine and I get together every once in a while for 40 minutes down at Glen Olden, and we watch them run through. Trains of today don't interest me as much, but it's still exciting to watch the Sullas and the various Amtrak trains just fly by 100 miles an hour plus. It still can be exciting. It's not as visually as interesting as it used to be, but it's a good thing, something to do.
I'm going to close off for myself by saying I really appreciate being invited into this. I learned a whole hell of a lot that I did not know about because I don't know the close local stories as much. I more think about the larger picture of its impact on the country.
Fleshed it out in that respect, and I think that's what needs to be done in context. Is something that certainly a nation-building subject. It's always interesting to know about what happened in the local area on the larger scale. As you pointed out, it's how the nation really progressed.
It's how America became America.
Absolutely.
Thank both of you very much for coming. This has been very enlightening, actually. I came into this knowing remarkably little about trains, and especially their local history. I was really surprised to learn how close a lot of this was to us.
Yeah, this has been a very illuminating time for us, certainly, and I'm sure for our viewers out there.
Well, listeners,
viewers.
Can you tell we're still getting the ropes on this?
But yeah, thank you both for coming today and just gushing about your passions here. And I just wanted to add, the book that you guys were mentioning was Nothing Like It in the World, The Men Who Built the Transcontinental Railroad, 1863 to 1869, by Stephen E. Ambrose.
Thank you again to our guests, and thank you for listening in to hear what we're geeking out about today. If you'd like to geek out with us sometime, just go to lansdownlibrary.org/podcast and click the green Register Here button for a chance to join us.
And on our next episode, tune in for a talk about Dungeons and Dragons, the popular role-playing game that was once relegated to something people did in their basement to a wide and beloved franchise. We'll hope you join us then.